To walk you through some of the ideas that we have on future issues, which is a product that we produce for a couple of our customers in the area of foresight. We do quite a bit of work on foresight for a couple of different customers, both in the public sector and the private sector. But this is really a new product that we're trying to develop, where we're trying to apply some of our ideas on metaforesight to various issues that our customers are interested in. A word about the background of our use of the word metaphor. You obviously have two different strains here, or strands on your screen. On the left hand side is the etymology of the word metaphor, the word that we, the way in which we commonly use it, which comes from the Greek. It's two parts. The first one is meta, which means above and beyond, and for comes from a verb, pheren, which means to carry essentially. And so metaphor comes from the idea that you carry a concept beyond its original meaning, which is of course the way in which we normally use metaphor. But the way in which we use it with the F, the second part of metaphor comes from foresight, which has again two components. For, to look forward, and sight from the verb to see, whereby essentially you try to look forward into the future. It's a Middle Eastern translation probably of the Latin word for providence, which again has the components pro, forward, and videre, to look. So the important point here to stress is that our view of foresight is very different from the traditional view of forecasting, where you just try to find some regularities in the past and you extrapolate those towards the future. Foresight has no such connotation of extrapolating from anything essentially. It's just a more neutral term that just tries to look forward without necessarily being too beholden to preconceived heuristics in our brain or various Gaussian or non-Gaussian views of the past. But it's really an unbiased view towards the future. So metaphor brings together these two components, and as you see at the bottom of the screen, it tries to be a meta-analysis of existing foresight exercises, while at the same time, by doing so, trying to carry the entire field of foresight beyond its current status. And I think the main insight that we're trying to hold on to is that we're trying to be honest about the future. We don't pretend that we have a crystal ball. We don't pretend that we really know all that much about the future, but we're just trying to map the views of existing foresight communities with respect to various issues that we are interested in. So I think if the future has inspired, at least for me as a former Soviet specialist, if it has inspired me one sentiment, it is a sentiment of incredible humility towards the totally unpredictable nature of what's ahead of us. That brings me to a slide in which I've tried to summarize some of the literature on risk, uncertainty, and foresight against all of this. A lot of the ideas go back to a seminal work by Frank Knight in 1921, in which he differentiates between risk and uncertainty. And I'm still very much struck that there is a certain obsession with risk, which he calls the more computable element of uncertainty. In Nassim Taleb's recent and of course very influential, especially now after the financial crisis, his book the Black Swan, he calls this element of risk the ludic fallacy, in which risk is essentially compared to what's going on in casinos all over the world, the gambling industry, which really doesn't have much uncertainty. I mean, a lot of this really is a Gaussian distribution in which casinos know exactly what they're doing, and they're pretty sure that they're going to make a lot of money. And this idea of risk, this Gaussian idea of risk and with bell curves, is still very much at the heart of the discipline. But Knight already in 21 pointed out that there's an other element of uncertainty, which is incomputable, which is epistemologically much more opaque. It's close to what Donald Rumsfeld used to call the unknown unknowns. I mean, it's unknown and we don't even know that we don't know it. Nassim Taleb talks here about Mandelbrottian uncertainty as opposed to Gaussian uncertainty. And it's very clear this field of investigation is very much up and coming, again, especially after the recent developments where The risk models that mathematicians, financial mathematicians had developed at the cost of literally millions of dollars basically failed to predict what we are seeing unfolding in front of our eyes at this very moment. So we're really trying to focus on the uncertainty bit of what's ahead of us. And if you look at our track record on foresight, it's really pretty dismal. Again, Taleb has a wonderful description of that in his book, in his chapter, which he calls the scandal of prediction. Now, it's fairly well understood why there is a systematic bias in the foresight community that does not lead to effective forecasting. And I've pointed out here some of the ideas, some of the models that people have used to point out some of the systematic flaws in the way in which we do this entire discipline. We also know empirically that the field is pretty bad. We know this in the field of finance and macroeconomic forecasting, and there's a fairly good literature on that. But we even know it in the area of political forecasting, in a wonderful book by Phil Tetlock, in which he has used predictions of about 300 political and economic experts, in which it turns out that and these were some of the top American experts in various fields, and it turns out that their error rates are much higher than they themselves had estimated, and they, of course, after the fact, they find various explanations why that is the case. But the experts don't do better than non-experts in forecasting, and in fact, he even finds a negative relationship between reputation and the accuracy of their predictions ex post. So the higher the reputation, the more reputable supposedly a person is, the lower the accuracy is of his predictions. So I think, again, this should inspire us with a lot of humility. If you look at the incredible effort that has been made in a couple of different fields and the low dividends that these efforts have paid, I think we have to use the necessary caution in our way of setting up this effort. Now, if there's one silver lining in the cloud, it's really that consensus forecasts seem to be much more robustly useful and accurate than the more individual forecasts. That's at least the case in economics. And there's a couple of reasons to think why it might also be the case in other fields other than economics. So especially if you're dealing with a diverse set of foresights, which of course we do in our approach to its Metafore site, where we really try to gather all of the relevant foresights from a variety of different contexts, and we try to summarize those. So the more diverse they are, and if you take a couple of simple rules of thumb into consideration, you might actually be able to be useful for policymakers by using this approach of consensus, which is really very much at the heart also of our Metafore site, Metafore approach, where we obviously do exactly that. This is a nice example that I found in one of the articles that deals with the way in which the macroeconomic forecast community has dealt with forecasts. And the thing I like about it is that you see over a couple of years the bandwidth of views of individual macroeconomic forecasters on, in this case, a fairly simple and straightforward forecast, that is the forecast of real GDP growth. And whereas this is, of course, a much more simple forecast than the ones that we are trying to look at, the main idea is very close to what I would like to achieve with our work, which is, again, to paint the bandwidth of views that we find back in the foresight community in the work that they do. Let me walk you a little bit then through the way in which we set up both the data sources and the methods to deal with them. Everything starts with a database which the European Foresight Monitoring Network, which is a consortium of European technology institutes primarily. And so this consortium has set up a database with various foresight exercises in a number of different countries, both within Europe and outside of Europe. So in 2006, for instance, they had about 1,400 exercises in there. And they do that according to a certain protocol which all participating institutions follow as they enter new foresight exercises into the database. You see here a little bit of the distribution. There's obviously selection bias in this data set. TNO, which is our mother organization, is the leading partner in this consortium. And TNO knows, of course, a lot more about the foresights being done in the Dutch government, for instance, than many other institutions in other countries, because TNO plays such a critical role in the Dutch government science interface. But nevertheless, it's a fairly sizable database, the most sizable that we are aware of, and we've been building it up quite a bit of the past year as well. This shows you a little bit also what kind of different methodologies are used in foresight exercises, and some of them are just basically expert panels, as you see on top there. But it ranges from real modeling and simulation to brainstorming to more traditional Delphi techniques. And the database, of course, gives us a very nice overview, a meta overview, I might add, of the various methodologies that are being used in these foresight exercises. So that's our basis, the Dynamo database with foresight exercises, which is not security specific. It's really security and all sorts of other different policy areas. It's not, again, purely European, although there is a certain Eurocentric bias and US-centric, or North America-centric, I should add. But so that's a very general database of high-quality foresight exercises that we now have, and that we've all analyzed on the basis of a number of parameters that are in the Dynamo database. Whenever we do a new foresight exercise on any individual issue in these future issues that we're developing now, we also try to do a specific search, which is then domain specific. So in the case of nanotechnology, for instance, we would go out and look for the most important foresight exercises done over the, say, past 10 years or so in this particular area, which could be based on Google, it could be based on academic searches, it could be based on all sorts of things. But essentially what we do with these exercises then is we do a meta-analysis of them, in which we try to look at the trends in these exercises. Is there a growing trend of the number of exercises on this particular topic, or the descending one? What is the real focus of them, and is there a trend in that? So we're really looking for trends and patterns in the foresight exercises themselves, and we also try to identify the main drivers and parameters of the topic that we're interested in, and I'll come back to that in a minute. At the same time, our idea is also that we want to complement these more serious, formal foresight exercises with more anecdotal evidence, which we can find in things such as Factiva, which is the world's largest database of newspaper articles, again across the world, where so we would do a search on words such as foresight, forecast, trends, scenarios, and then the topic that we're interested in, for instance, nanotechnology. And we could also do the same in a number of full-text academic databases, and then get a set of PDF files, again, essentially, which would have references to the future of nanotechnology. Of course, these data sets are much larger than the data sets on the left side of your screen, and therefore, in order to be able to analyze them, we use a text mining tool which was developed by the Russian Academy of Sciences, or a spin-off of the Russian Academy of Sciences, a company by the name of Microsystems, and the tool itself is called Text Analyst. And Text Analyst gives us lists of the top N, let's say the top 500 semantically most important concepts in these various data sets that we have developed. And not only the top 100 or 500 or 1,000 most important concepts, but also the associations between them. So for instance, we're of course mostly interested in security-related semantic concepts. So we look for those semantic concepts that are most highly associated with words such as security, threat, risk, things like that. And once we have that, both the list with the most important concepts and the associations of those concepts with other concepts, we can then try to discern patterns and trend within those essentially XML files that we get out of the system. And finally, the combination of the more manual meta-analysis that you see on the left hand of this slide with the more automated version on the right hand side leads to what we then call Metafore, which with time will become an interactive system where anybody can use the data set that we have developed, looking for elements that he or she may be interested in. Now I should point out that we have in theory all the elements that are necessary for both sides of the slide here, but for the nanotechnology one we are so far focusing primarily on the left hand side. We are still evaluating a number of other text mining tools to see to what extent they can help us. And the right side of the slide, although we have the important elements and we can use it, is not something that we want to put as a standard element of the protocol that we use quite yet. But I did want to show you that this is what we're working towards. Oh yeah, and then finally we also try to feed our Dynamo database with the nuggets, as we call them, both from the Google searches that we do and also the searches on EBSCO and on newspapers. So whenever there's a reference in there about a serious foresight exercise, for instance in this case on nanotechnology, we will of course add it to the Dynamo database. This is an example, for instance, of the database in which we have about 2,000 foresight exercises now, and it shows you a little bit what it is about. Some of them are from the military background, because that's a lot of the work that we do. But there are also things in there, as you may see, about aquaculture, aluminum, city foresights, demographic foresights. So it's a fairly large data set, which is quite varied, but we're still working on completing it almost on a weekly basis. Now let me walk you through the manual process, the left side of the slide which I showed you, and how we do that. So we first of all have augmented the Dynamo database with a set of foresights, and I will give you the example of the Russia future issue, which we're still working on, parallel to the one that we're doing now on nanotech. But so we've collected about 70 additional what we felt serious foresight exercises on Russia of the past 10 years or so. And so what we do with that is we put them in a spreadsheet, and we label them with some of the most important characteristics, fields that are in the Dynamo database. So the organization that set up the foresight, when it was done, what the time horizon was, what the most important subject was, what the year of publication was. And so you see here a little bit of a snapshot of some of those Russian foresight exercises, the language that they were in, who did them, whether it was a research institute or a government organization that did it, or just a journal article. So that's how we start. So we take the large list of exercises that we found, and we basically put them in an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of columns describing the main attributes of those foresight exercises. The next step then is that based on that information, we can already do some meta-analysis of these foresight exercises. For instance, what you see on this slide here depicts over the years which topics were most present in the foresight literature on Russia. The next step then is that we actually go to those exercises and we read them and we start coding them. So we're systematically looking for the drivers that are driving the future of Russia. We're looking for the most salient aspects, characteristics, parameters, whatever you want to call it, of Russia, and we also code those. So we basically go through the text and are constantly coding words in that text for the elements of the foresight exercise that we're looking for. Again, we put all that stuff in a database, in an Excel spreadsheet, with on the left side the various scenario exercises, and then the elements that we are looking at in the various columns with the operationalized values already in there, and I'll come back to that in a minute. That gives us then radar charts, which basically depict a future Russia, the main parameters of a future Russia in a synoptic way, essentially. So here you see 9 future scenarios about Russia depicted in one slide. And then finally, and this is really what we're looking for, we get a histogram with the distributions of the various values that we find back in the scenario exercises for the most important parameters of Russia that we're interested in. For instance, if you take the first one on the left-hand side, so you see 4 basic elements here: the political future of Russia, the economic future, the societal future, and then foreign and security policy, which is something that we're particularly interested in. But so you see, for instance, on the left-hand side, with respect to the centralization of the Russian polity, that the views are quite polarized. So there's about as many exercises that seem to think that Russia will be much less centralized, a lot of the ones that think it will be highly centralized, and a small group of people think it's somewhere in the middle. What we are basically looking for here is robust findings. And so you see, for instance, on Russia, that the views on the future of Russia are very distributed, that there is no bar that really leaps out in which all of the foresight specialists agree that, for instance, the future of Russia will be stable, which is something that up until recently most people would have said. But you see here, for instance, in these foresight exercises, there are as many foresight exercises that seem to think that Russia will be unstable as there will be stable or something in between. But so that's really what we're looking for here. We're trying to code the various foresight exercises in such a way that we can then at the end show the bandwidth of views within the foresight community on the most important parameters of that topic that we're interested in. So let me walk you a little bit more in detail through this. So this is again the list of the Russian foresights in a little bit more detail. This is the spreadsheet then that we made that you saw a little piece of before with respect to the main characteristics of the foresight exercises. Here again, the picture that you saw before in small here and a little bit bigger, which shows, for instance, that up until 2005, for instance, if you look at security policy, there really wasn't much foresight done on security policy in the Yeltsin era or the beginning of the Putin era. And it's really only afterwards that you see a number of exercises being done again. A topic like demography, on the other hand, the second one from the top, you see that it really has been an important point of interest for the foresight community throughout this entire period. You also see, for instance, in 2007, and that's when this was predominantly done, you get a much richer variety of foresight exercises. So in other words, the world is again becoming much more interested in Russia in all of its different aspects, which was not the case for about a decade before. So you see a growing trend in the overall number of foresight exercises, and you see a much wider distribution of these exercises across the different subject areas that we have identified. Here you see again the time horizon, whereby you see that most of the exercises, of course, tend to focus in the sort of 10 to 15 year time horizon, but you again see a bigger distribution in 2007 than ever before. If you look at who does it, you see that government again is becoming more interested in all of its different permutations, as you see them here on the source on the left hand side. So whereas in the 90s there wasn't hardly any government foresight being done on Russia, you now see a whole bunch of them, and some of them are actually quite interesting as well. And also you see a broader community becoming much more interested in Russia as well. So the work that you do on the characteristics of the foresight exercises in and of themselves already allows you to do a meta-analysis of what this foresight population universe that you're looking at is actually looks like. So that's the first step, the meta-analysis of the exercises themselves. The second step is that we try to actually look in the text themselves, and we're looking for what we call drivers, parameters, and implications. Let's start with the parameters. So if we take any particular topic, and let's, for the sake of this particular argument, say that we're interested in foresight on future me's, me, myself, I. What is the future of me as an individual? And the first thing that we're interested in is what is it about myself, about the future me's, that could possibly change? So what are the parameters of future me's that we can actually list? So you can start making a list, and I've just put some here, more for fun than anything else. But so, my future health is something that could vary. I could be healthy in the future, I could be much less healthy. My location, where will I be living and working? That could certainly change. My salary might change. My weight, hopefully, will change. So you try to identify the main parameters of your future me that are liable to change or susceptible to change in the time frame that you're interested in. And once you've made that list, you try to find smart ways to operationalize those. And again, here, when you think operationalization, think slide bars. They're very useful visual tools, especially also for policymakers, that allow them to actually get it. So when you think, for instance, about openness, how open are you as an individual? Try to think of ways in which you can operationalize what you read in the literature, if there ever were literature on future me's, on this particular parameter, and try to put those on the extremes then, so that you can actually map the bandwidth of the data points that you do find in the foresight literature, so they can map them along a scale. Now bear in mind that these do not have to be interval level data. Hopefully they won't be just nominal, but just ordinal ones will be quite alright. Don't try to be too purist about that, but do try to at least develop a metric for them. because the whole idea, if you want to make insights from foresight comparable, you have to develop metrics that allow you to actually pin them down. And I think we've been fairly successful at that. We have quite a bit of experience on this now, and I hope at some point that we can share some of those experiences with you. Most of the work we do on this is on benchmarking, where governments ask us to benchmark what they are doing in defense and security against other governments or other institutions. Now, in this process, we've had to operationalize definitions, for instance, develop metrics for definitions, develop metrics for institutions, develop metrics for processes. So all these things that are really quite hard to measure, but we have found ways, sometimes via proxies, sometimes via other ways, to operationalize almost anything that we're interested in. So that's what the whole thing starts with. You look at the topic that you're interested in, you parameterize it, and then operationalize it. The second step then is to look for the drivers. So assume that you have different points on that on these slide bars for all the parameters that you're interested in. And you would have multiple ones, because normally you have multiple foresight exercises that deal with this. So the main question you ask here with respect to the drivers is, what is likely to drive change in the parameters of these future needs? So as you see things shifting, for instance, from in health or in location or in salary, if you see shifts in that, what does it do to? What drives change in these parameters in the exercise that you're looking at? And just to give you some examples here, most of them would be external. For instance, the labor market would affect, for instance, both the location where you would be in the future. It might affect your salary. It might even affect your weight if you're lucky enough to move to California, for instance. But it could, the problem that you have here is that these are frequently very different animals. That's why I, for instance, put my wife's tolerance of my future me in here. Sometimes, there are really apples and oranges, but I think it's important to, on a non-preconceived basis, to just list all those drivers that you find in the exercises. So as you're coding them, as you're reading through them, just sort of color code drivers with a particular color, and then put them all in a long list, and subsequently you can see if you can somehow categorize them, cluster them. But that's the way I would go about that. I mean, you can sometimes use preconceived setups, and for instance in the Russia case which I showed you, that's essentially what we did. But I think the more useful approach generally is to just start without a bias, but to just inductively list the various drivers that you find in those exercises. And then again, you operationalize all of them. And then finally, in the last step in this particular exercise, you look for implications. And to be quite honest, I'm not particularly happy with the way in which we've done that so far. And so I'm certainly willing to listen to any ideas that you might have on how we do that. But so this is the basic setup. You parameterize the topic that you're interested in. What is it about this topic that might change in the future? You then look at the drivers. What will trigger changes in these parameters in the future? And then finally, you look at what these various parameters and changes in those parameters, what implications that would have for international security. Let me give you a concrete example that we did for a study for NATO as part of the long-term requirements study, which is the way in which NATO tries to look at the sort of the 20-year time horizon. And they have a whole methodology for doing so, which I won't bother you with. But the most important point I want to tell you here is on the left side, they asked us 2 years ago to do two relatively large studies. One was an analysis of the security environment, for which we also use foresight. But the second one, and this is the one I want to talk to you about here, is that they also asked us to look at essentially future me's, but in their case, of course, future NATOs. So what could plausible future NATOs look like? Again, not in a predictive mode, but just what are the, analytically speaking, what are the main different elements of NATO that there could be. Now the way we should do that, well, let me quickly go through that, is that we did a scenario workshop for the future NATOs with a couple of mostly Dutch but quite diverse participants, both from the military, from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, other ministries, but also a number of NGOs, sort of more the peace community. So we really had quite diverse set of people, and we split them up into different groups to have a fairly robust finding. And this is the way we went about that. We basically asked them three different things. The boundaries of this exercise, by the way, was in terms of spatial boundaries, there were none. In terms of the theme, it was obviously about NATO, and with a very clear defense planning focus. And in terms of the time horizon, we were looking at 2025. So we asked them 3 different things. The main was the characteristics. Remember the parameters I told you about before. So what are the aspects of NATO that are likely to change in your mind? Secondly, we asked them to identify drivers, also with an eye towards uncertainties. And thirdly, we also asked them to make a list of possible wildcards. So low probability, high impact events that might occur. That's something that's not frequently done. It's still very hard to really organically integrate that into a scenario exercise, but we are increasingly doing that as well. And then finally, you get images of future NATOs out of that, in which you can write a plot, sort of a story that captures the dynamics of what you've, the analysis that you've done, and that also is a more effective communication tool. So this is the way we did it. We had 2 separate syndicates. We did this in one afternoon, incidentally. So we asked people to generate both. We gave them different pieces of paper, and we asked them, okay, write on the blue ones you write drivers, on the yellow ones you write characteristics, and on the red ones you write wildcards. So you got a whole bunch of stick-it notes, which you then had them jointly cluster. You had them vote on it, what are the most important ones, and then you had them operationalize it along a sort of a slide bar, as I said before. We then brought the groups together and we combined them, which allowed us to generate future NATOs. Let me give you some examples to make it more concrete. So with respect to NATO characteristics, we came up with a whole list of elements, aspects of NATO in the future that might change, and that would be relevant for defense planning, because that's really what we're looking at. So to give you just 2 examples, one is of course the mission spectrum. Does the North Atlantic Council, the ambassadors of NATO, do they, or the heads of state, do they allow NATO to participate across the entire military spectrum, i.e. including high-intensity warfare, or do they say, no, that's not really what NATO is about, it should be more about political discussions? That matters a lot for defense planning. Right now we are sort of at the Article 5, which is collective defense, plus expeditionary, but it's perfectly plausible, for instance, to think that after a backlash against failed operations, the NAC might decide to shift the whole organization much more towards the left. So you just try to pick the bandwidth of views within the people that you're looking at. And in this case, this was a workshop, so we could actually ask people what they thought. But what we tried to do is to tease this information out of existing documents. So mission spectrum is one of the characteristics of NATO that came out of both groups as being an important one. The second important one, of course, is the membership. How large is the membership of NATO? So we constantly currently are in a situation where we're 26 going to 28. But the bandwidth, I mean, that could change. It could be more member states might become members of NATO in the future. And at the same time, some member states might decide to withdraw from the organization, as for instance France did when it withdrew from the Integrated Military Command under de Gaulle. And it's now, of course, reintegrating. But so you make a list of the characteristics, and then you try to develop jointly, in this case, slide bars, scales along which those particular parameters can be operationalized. The second thing is you ask the group, in this particular case, for drivers. What actually triggers change in these missions? So for instance, to give you 2 examples, active U.S. leadership was seen by everybody as one of the key drivers of change in possible future NATOs. And the idea was, for instance, if the U.S. takes an active leadership role within NATO, the mission spectrum is likely to go more towards the right, more towards the high-intensity warfare. Membership is also likely to go more to the right. Let's not forget that the U.S. was one of the main instigators of enlargement of NATO, the successive enlargements of NATO that we've seen over the past decade. The second one might be a threatening peer competitor, for instance, China. What would this do to the mission spectrum? It would arguably also move it to the right. If there's sufficient consensus within NATO on doing anything, it would be moving it to the right. What would it do to membership? Well, sometimes you just don't know. For instance, the key factor here is what would be the role of Russia in this new equation. Would Russia tend to favor rapprochement with the West in light of a rising China, or would it, on the other hand, bandwagon with China and thereby balancing against the West? So we basically cannot plausibly, deductively conclude what the implications would be for threatening China for membership. But so this way, this shows you a little bit what we mean by characteristics or parameters on the one hand and drivers, and how we did it in this particular case. So what we did then in this particular group, just to walk you through the end of this exercise, is we had a list of drivers and a list of parameters. We had a discussion in the group on all of them, and we ended up with essentially 3 major drivers that most agreed were the key ones driving the future of NATO. The one on the vertical axis is whether or not the US is willing to exert leadership within NATO. The second one, the horizontal one, is whether the EU is fragmented and therefore weak, or whether the European Union is a coherent actor in world politics and in world security and therefore is also a stronger actor. And the third axis, which is the one that goes in the depth, is whether or not there is a common perceived threat, irrespective of whether that threat is terrorism or global warming or a peer competitor. But those were the 3 main axes along which, the 3 main drivers along which these groups agreed NATO could differ. And then we came up with a number of different NATOs. Okay, so let's apply this now to the future issues as we're doing them right now, where I remind you we are not dealing with groups that were asking about nanotechnologies or groups that were asking about Russia, but we're just trying to tease this information out of available, publicly available foresight exercises. With respect to Russia, we once again fall back on a spreadsheet, where in the first column you see all the scenarios and all the exercises that we came up with. And then we basically coded all of the parameters that we found important in these exercises one by one, as you see in the various columns. So for instance, the centralization of Russia, of the future Russia, with the 3 being the highly decentralized and a 1 being highly centralized. The stability of the future Russia, the political system, whether it's more democratic or authoritarian, the degree of corruption in the system. So all these parameters we coded for every exercise where we could find an honest figure for that particular parameter in the exercise that we're looking at. So again, you get a large spreadsheet that then yields these kinds of radar charts. Whenever I make a radar chart, I try to make sure that the full radar chart, that there is a certain logic to the coding. That is, that 3 is always either sort of good or bad, or high or low, so there's a certain system behind it. And the system behind this one would be, and some of that is arbitrary, but still at least it's consistent in our minds. The 3s are the ones that are sort of a good Russia, from our view, a decentralized Russia, a stable Russia, a democratic Russia, a non-corrupt Russia, an economically differentiated Russia with a high economic growth, with a free market economy, open to international economy, and so on and so forth. A tolerant Russia. So that's a full radar chart, and then you get these various radar charts in which the individual future Russias that you find back in the exercises can be plotted in a systematic way, and then leading to these kinds of histograms, which I already explained to you before. So that is essentially the way in which we do the manual setup for our future issues, and in which we also want to do the nanotech foresight. As we move forward, and especially given the enormous labor intensity of the process that I've just described, we are of course constantly looking for more automated ways of doing that, and text mining plays a critical role here. And I just want to show you a couple of things that we're doing with this. I told you that we're looking with our text mining tool for co-occurrences of the words risk, security, defense. There's a couple of words that we look for co-occurrences of these words within one sentence with other highly semantically weighty concepts within the text. And this gives you graph data which you can map in a variety of different ways. We did, for instance, a piece of work on the future of energy, and we looked in the data set that we collected on that for those words that are more relevant. So for instance, here in this particular tree map you see 2 pieces of information essentially. The one is how weighty a concept is within the set of documents that you've text mined. So for instance, technology on the top left corner came out as the most important concept within the set that we looked at. So that's the first piece of information. The larger the square or the rectangle, the more weighty that concept is within the set of documents. And the second piece of information here you see is that the redder a concept is, the more important it has become in recent years. So for instance, China, as you see there, has really skyrocketed in importance within the energy foresight community of the past couple of years. So that's another visualization that we make out of this. And then we have dynamic visualizations where you can, for instance, see, and this is again on the data set on Russia that we did, where we did text mine about, say, thousands articles from the Western press that dealt with the future of Russia. And you see, for instance, the relative importance of military going down in the 90s. I don't think I can actually play this. No, I can't. But so you see it go down over time and then coming up again in more recent years, whereas energy stays fairly stable on top of that. But again, that's more towards the future. The main message I think I want to leave you with is the one that this one here. The way in which you want to do this. So on the left-hand side here, that I really want for nanotechnology for us to focus on the left side. And I think what we really have to do now is to find some more foresight exercises in a variety of different contexts. And I think it doesn't have to take all that long. We have a number of tricks, and I'm sure you have your own research tricks to do this. But I would think you could probably find, I mean, if you had, you said you had about 30 that you looked at right now, I would think we should be able to get a set of about 70, 80 foresight exercises, serious ones over the past 10 years, which we can then all code in accordance with those labels that we have in the spreadsheets, and that then can also be entered in Dynamo, and in which we can also actually code the individual texts in the searching for parameters and drivers, and then also for security implications. So that's really what I would still like to focus us on. But of course we can discuss that at the at a WebEx meeting that we'll have tomorrow. Okay, I just didn't want to do all of this tomorrow because it does take some time, but at least I hope it helps you a little bit in understanding where we're coming from and why we want to do it in this particular way. Again, I mean, oftentimes foresight is just a bunch of experts pretending that they can see the future, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, because there's obviously a very rich information set in the minds of these experts. But what we are just trying to show is the bandwidth of these various views on the future of any particular issue, in this case nanotech. And I think in the work that we've done so far, that hasn't really come out sufficiently yet, and I hope we can still do that in the next couple of weeks. Okay, I'll talk to you tomorrow, and I'm going to go get some sleep. Bye.